Welcome everyone. On behalf of the United Nations and the World Organization of United Cities and Local Governments, we would like to welcome you to this UN dialogue on the UN we need. Before yielding the floor to our chair, the Under Secretary-General of the United Nations, Mr. Fabricio Hochschild, I would like to give you some technical details. As you know, we have interpretation in English, Spanish, and French. Please go to the bottom of your screen to select the language that you would like to use. To all the attendees, please be aware that we have a question and answers chat. Feel free to write your questions to the panelists. Welcome everyone. USG, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and a very warm welcome to all of you. I hope very much that everybody is in good health and good cheer. And a particular welcome to our leader here at the United Nations, His Excellency, the President of the General Assembly, Volkan Bozkır. And we have many other distinguished excellencies with us. We also have a great group of young people, and of course, you, the wonderful participants. I'm delighted to welcome you to this UN75 event, a dialogue on the UN we need, which we're hosting in participation with the United Cities and Local Government Organization, UCLG. I want to thank the United Nations office in Venezuela in particular for the music competition they ran for the 75th anniversary. And we were just treated now to the winner of that event, a national network of youth orchestras and choirs called El Sistema. Venezuela is a country of extraordinary musical talent, and I think we just got a taste of that. This Saturday, we marked the UN's 75th anniversary. We have to recall, and this for me is almost ungraspable, that in the midst of the most destructive war ever, way before the Allied forces had actually prevailed in that war, the conceptualization of the United Nations came about. And leaders who are dealing every day with the most extreme, fundamental existential threats to their nations and their peoples had the courageous, far-sighted vision to conceive of a mechanism to secure peace and progress and social justice for future generations. They were motivated by an overwhelming desire to secure a much better world than the one that they themselves had grown up in. After 2 world wars, they understood that cooperation and compromise and setting some guardrails to nationalism was essential to securing everyone's welfare and well-being. And most of us, not all of us, but most of us have benefited incredibly through our lifetimes from that incredible vision. But what sort of world will we leave behind? Today, we're more interconnected and more interdependent than ever. And yet we see, in the words of the United Nations Secretary-General, a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. This, of course, is in part to resurgent superpower rivalries, but it's also due to a growing sense that recently multilateralism has not delivered in terms of coming to terms with some of the biggest challenges we face, from the climate emergency to long-standing COVID, and also to conflicts. It's against this backdrop that the Secretary-General launched the UN75 initiative. He wanted to reconnect to those to whom we are ultimately accountable, those captured in the first 3 words of our charter, we the peoples, and draw inspiration and guidance from them on how we can improve. And we went to them with 4 questions. What are your main priorities for recovery post-COVID? What are your priorities for the world 25 years from now? And what do you see as the biggest threats in current global megatrends to those priorities? And finally, what are your expectations of international cooperation and of the United Nations in particular? We've received feedback from thousands of dialogues in well over 100 states. Our mini survey was responded to by close to 1.0 states. We also reached out to think tanks and universities across the world to get their inputs. And finally, we also got independent, scientifically based, sampled representative surveys in 50 countries, managed by two of the world's most foremost polling companies, Edelman and Pew, from whom we will hear shortly. We will then hear also reactions from leading voices from civil society, youth, business, and local government in the form of Mary Robinson of the Elders, Vanessa Nakate, John Frank, Anne Norgam, and Emilia Saiz. And then we'll also get your comments from the floor, and we'll hear from distinguished ambassadors here in New York, from Afghanistan, from Palestine, from Qatar and Lesotho, among others. We are very honored that in our concluding remarks, so please stick with us, we'll be also hear from Thomas Bach, the president of the International Olympic Committee. The IOC has been instrumental in helping UN75 reach new audiences and highlighting the crucial links between sport, peace, and development. So I'm delighted first for this very exciting series of speakers and discussion to start with the very outstanding Mayor of Barcelona and UCLG Special Envoy, Madam Ada Colau. And then the floor will go to our very able moderator, Nathalie Samarasinga. So Madam Colau, Mayor Colau, over to you.
Thank you very much. We have translation, so I will speak in Spanish. Muchísimas gracias, Fabrizio. Muchísimas gracias y buenas tardes al presidente de la Asamblea General, subsecretario general de Naciones Unidas y en general a toda la amplia representación de Naciones Unidas. Como representante de CGLU ante Naciones Unidas queremos agradecer muchísimo que Naciones Unidas haya querido coorganizar este importante seminario con CGLU. Para nosotros es un reconocimiento importante. Y en general también saludar a todos los representantes de la sociedad civil, de movimientos sociales y distintas entidades que nos acompañan. Para mí es un placer estar aquí, como decía, no solo como alcaldesa de Barcelona, sino también como representante del movimiento global municipalista ante Naciones Unidas, para hablar sobre cómo deben ser las Naciones Unidas del futuro y cuál es el sistema multilateral que necesitamos. Personalmente creo que tenemos ahora una información muy valiosa, ¿no? Nos preguntamos, ¿cómo quieren que sea el futuro de Naciones Unidas las personas que habitan el planeta, el conjunto del planeta? Bueno, pues ahora tenemos una información muy valiosa que se ha recogido en el informe del 75 aniversario de Naciones Unidas, una iniciativa muy acertada que nos ha mostrado lo que la gente espera y, por lo tanto, que debe ayudarnos, que debe guiarnos para impulsar cualquier movimiento o transformación de la organización hacia un futuro inmediato. Es imprescindible escuchar la voz de las comunidades para no equivocarnos, porque el futuro de Naciones Unidas pasa sin ningún tipo de duda por su acercamiento a las personas, a la realidad, a los territorios concretos. Es muy bonito poder pararse e imaginar el futuro que queremos. Es bonito y es necesario e imprescindible en un momento de crisis como el actual. Y es también bonito darnos cuenta, en medio de tanta complejidad y tanta dificultad como la que estamos viviendo, pero es hermoso poder ver que cuando nos sentamos y nos encontramos personas muy diversas de rincones muy distintos del mundo, en realidad lo que deseamos para el futuro de nuestros hijos e hijas se parece bastante y eso es hermoso. Hay algo que nos une claramente, que hace coherente eso que llamamos humanidad y que pasa por poner la vida en el centro de todas las prioridades. Un futuro mejor para la gran mayoría de personas en este planeta, sin ninguna duda, incluye un mundo que lucha contra las desigualdades como prioridad. Incluye también un futuro que facilite el acceso a los servicios básicos a todas las personas sin distinción, y en esos servicios básicos destacar el acceso universal a los servicios públicos de salud y de educación, una cosa que en la crisis actual todo el mundo tiene muy presente. Un mundo que cuida el planeta y la vida y, por lo tanto, que pone los cuidados en el centro de las prioridades de las políticas públicas. Y, en general, un mundo que coopera para superar de forma conjunta los grandes retos a los que nos enfrentamos. Como alcaldesa y como representante de este movimiento centenario municipalista que es CGLU, una de las cosas que más me impacta de los resultados de este informe es que muchos de los cambios que se consideran más necesarios son los que se están impulsando desde hace tiempo desde las ciudades en muchos lugares del planeta. La defensa de la igualdad y de los derechos básicos de las personas se trabaja sin ninguna duda en las ciudades, en la relación que establecen los gobiernos locales con las personas. Por ejemplo, ha sido en las ciudades donde se ha reivindicado la vivienda como un derecho básico con más fuerza. Y cuando decimos la vivienda como un derecho básico, como un derecho humano fundamental, quiere decir que eso es incompatible con un bien económico orientado a la especulación. También las ciudades están llevando a cabo profundas transformaciones para acabar con la contaminación, porque respirar el aire limpio es también un derecho básico que se debe proteger de forma proactiva. La denuncia de la precariedad laboral, que combinada con la especulación de los bienes básicos, hace muy difícil que las personas puedan acceder a una vida digna en nuestros barrios, en nuestras ciudades. Hemos trabajado y seguiremos trabajando para cumplir con la provisión de servicios públicos, que no solo resultaron esenciales para luchar contra las consecuencias inmediatas de la crisis, sino, como se demuestra en el informe, son y serán fundamentales para garantizar una recuperación sostenible e integradora para todas las personas. Este es el mandato, sin ninguna duda, de los gobiernos locales y regionales, si bien son objetivos que no siempre coinciden con nuestras competencias. De hecho, por ser más explícita, todo es de nuestra incumbencia. Las ciudades nos ocupamos de absolutamente todo porque nos ocupamos de la vida de nuestros ciudadanos y, por lo tanto, todo es de nuestra incumbencia. Sin embargo, somos las administraciones que tenemos menos competencias formales, menos competencias legales, legislativas y menos presupuestos, menos recursos económicos. Pero a pesar de eso, no nos rendimos nunca porque no podemos rendirnos y le ponemos imaginación, cooperación, creatividad para dar respuesta a las necesidades de la ciudadanía. Y esta insuficiencia de las competencias, de los recursos que se le reconocen a las ciudades, tiene que ver con un debate muy actual, que tiene que ver también con el encuentro de hoy, que es cuál es el papel de las ciudades en la gobernanza global. Creemos sinceramente que las ciudades deben ganar un papel rápidamente más determinante en esta gobernanza global, porque si queremos más eficacia en las políticas públicas, ¿no? Los estados deben entender que tienen en las ciudades a sus aliadas naturales para poder implementar las macropolíticas que se deciden a alto nivel, pero que luego hay que bajar, hay que aterrizar a la realidad material y compleja de las personas. Por lo tanto, la voz de las ciudades debe ser escuchada, y no solo escuchada, sino que tenemos que poder participar en el diseño de las políticas que luego afectan a nuestros ciudadanos y ciudadanas. Es inconcebible que existan legislaciones que dificultan la labor y las políticas de proximidad que se llevan a cabo en las ciudades, y nos debemos asegurar que se pueda acceder desde el mundo municipal a los recursos necesarios. Somos muy conscientes de que las ciudades solas no podemos llevar a cabo la transformación, las distintas transformaciones que debemos impulsar, pero tampoco los estados pueden hacerlo solos y tampoco las empresas, el mundo económico lo puede hacer por sí solo. Debe ser un trabajo multinivel de cooperación donde tenemos que estar todos con objetivos compartidos, poniendo la vida por delante de otros intereses más particulares y para sumar en la defensa de lo que las personas necesitan y esperan de nosotros. Por eso necesitamos unas Naciones Unidas más fuertes que nunca, para poder generar un sólido sistema de gobernanza multilateral y una nueva cultura de colaboración en materia de gobernanza que pueda guiar los pasos a dar para afrontar un mundo tan interconectado, pero que necesita claramente una transformación que no puede esperar más. Y para que el mundo local pueda sumar en este sistema, es importante que obtengamos como ciudades, como CGLU, ese estatus de observador permanente ante la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas. Este estatus de observador reconocería nuestro carácter gubernamental. En CGLU nos hemos propuesto conseguirlo pronto y empezar así un camino de empoderamiento del mundo local como actor de primer orden en esta gobernanza global. Las ciudades estamos listas, termino ya, y estamos claramente dispuestas para apoyar a Naciones Unidas en la elaboración de un programa mundial inclusivo y sostenible, teniendo siempre presente lo que las personas esperan de nosotras en el presente y en el futuro. Debemos avanzar desde ya mismo hacia un mañana más equitativo, más verde, más feminista, más justo y más solidario. Aquí nos tienen para conseguirlo. Está claro que no hay planeta B, que el tiempo corre en nuestra contra, que hay que impulsar grandes, enormes y valientes transformaciones y las ciudades estamos preparadas para coliderar ese cambio. Así que muchísimas gracias y devuelvo la palabra a Fabrizio. Gracias.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd now like to give the floor to my very admired and esteemed President of our General Assembly, His Excellency Volkan Bozkır, who is presiding over what is perhaps, apart from the very first General Assembly, the most historically significant General Assembly of our time. President, over to you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General of the United Cities and Local Government Global Task Force, Under Secretary General Mr. Hochschild, and of course, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would first like to extend my sincere appreciation to the United Cities and Local Government, as well as Ms. Seiss for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak. I would also like to congratulate Under Secretary General Hochschild and your UN75 campaign team on the successful launch of the findings of the survey. And thank you for sharing these informative results. As President of the General Assembly, I had the honor of presiding over the 21st September high-level event on UN75, as mandated by the General Assembly. And I was very encouraged to see such impressive participation by UN member states. So much so, in fact, that an additional session had to be organized yesterday to accommodate the many statements that were received. I'm also pleased to note that this ambitious participation translated into the UN 75 declaration, whereby member states committed to listening to the concerns and aspirations of the survey results, pledging we are here to respond. The UN has turned 75, and this is both a cause for celebration, but also for reflection and growth. So while it would be easy to stand before you and list 75 years of accomplishments or lessons learned, the truth is now, more than ever, the UN must be forward-looking, ever mindful of our past, but always vigilant about what lies ahead. It is fair to say that 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored and emphasized that point. Few of us could have imagined this time last year what was to come. As the UN 75 survey rightly points out, the ongoing pandemic, as well as its related socio-economic impacts, remain primary concerns for the international community. People the world over remain concerned about their health, their jobs, their livelihoods, their education, and access to social services. We know this. We also know that the world expects a UN that will step up and do what it needs to do to meet these challenges. We must be at the forefront of helping those in need. We must work with governments to strengthen healthcare systems. We must advocate for fair and equitable access to vaccines. if or when they become available, of course. And we must work to recover better, to build a stronger, more sustainable world. All of this is in the survey, and these are the demands of the people of the world. It's our job now to take that forward, and we have the blueprint to guide our way out of the COVID-19 and to embrace a future that is more sustainable and more resilient. The Sustainable Development Goals are our compasses to a better future. Now more than ever, we must follow the steps they outline, investing in resilient infrastructure, in protecting life on land and below water, in securing social services. COVID-19 has been a tragedy, to be sure, and it certainly remains a challenge with no clear end in sight. But it is also an opportunity, I think, a chance to hit the reset button, to recover better, and to refocus our attention on a better path forward. Dear friends, the UN was founded 75 years ago on the pillars of human rights, peace and security, and sustainable development. Through all of these run the aspirations of a just world, an equal society, and a dignified life. As we look forward, we must aim to recover from the pandemic in a way that reaffirms our commitment to the principles outlined in the Charter. Now, more than ever, we must embrace multilateralism and work as one. Now, more than ever, we must work to protect our planet and advance human civilization in a way that is sustainable. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I wish you all the best in your panel discussions. I'm looking forward to many of such meetings together, and thank you once more very much for having me in this wonderful meeting.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Thank you for presenting the findings or mentioning the findings of the UN75 consultation. We will start with a short film now, and then we're privileged to have with us Penelope Mantasares, the Senior Vice President at Edelman Intelligence, and Jeb Bell, the Vice President of Global Strategy at the Pew Research Center, to give us their expert views on our consultation results. Both Pew and Edelman have been instrumental in shaping our initiative and ensuring we had independent representative data to serve as a reality check on our own efforts. So first we'll go now to the film, and then we'll go straight over to Penelope.
Our world is facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change is altering natural balance. And our precious wildlife is struggling to survive. We are battling a new era of conflict and violence. There's the disruptive impact from digital technologies and shifting demographics with gaping inequalities. Now, a global epidemic is reshaping our world as we know it. We are at a crossroad at a time when our world seems so divided. Our world is struggling to breathe. For the United Nations 75th anniversary, we set out to ask the world, what are your hopes for your future?
If you could choose one thing to say to the UN, to world leaders about the future, what would that be?
In January 2020, the United Nations launched a global initiative to have the world's largest conversation on the future we want. Discussions have taken place in all settings, from classrooms to boardrooms, parliaments to village halls across the world, in order to reach as many people as possible. The United Nations listened, and the world spoke.
Justice, equality, and freedom for all.
People can really be in peace and with dignity, because our dignity was taken away from us because of our religion and because of who we are. And I hope that we are the last community who are suffering of those problems.
Health is often looked at as an expense. It is not. It is an investment.
We change by exchanging without losing ourselves.
We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
If we don't stop the destruction of our natural world, nothing else will matter.
More than ever before, we need solidarity, hope, and the political will to see this crisis through together.
From what we have heard, the world is not as divided as we thought. The global economy, healthcare, sanitation, education, and the hardest places hit are our top priorities from recovering from the pandemic. In response to COVID-19, greater international solidarity is urgently needed. The threat of climate change and destruction of our natural environment is the biggest fear for the future. We need increased efforts to reduce conflict and violence, and we aspire to further protect human rights. For optimism about our future, we need to look to our young people. The overwhelming majority of us believe global cooperation is more vital than ever.
Every time we fail to find solutions to global challenges, the most vulnerable people in our societies are hit the hardest.
Throughout history, we have accomplished unimaginable things, propelling each generation further than the last. There is no limit to the amount of good we can achieve together to make this world, our world, a better place. The challenges before us are universal, and we know that these challenges demand global solutions. We have the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all, the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2045, the United Nations 100th year, let's see the change we have implemented today that will shine a light on our children's tomorrow.
Change is coming. The real power belongs to the people.
And I want to turn the question inside out as well. I will not ask, how dare you? Instead, I will ask, do you dare to?
This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages. Now must be our moment for action.
So I'm Jeb Bell from Pew Research Center. Penelope Manzares is with us too. She and I will co-present for a few moments. I want to say thank you to Fabrizio, the whole UN75 initiative team. I want to thank everyone on this call, all the eminences, and just a wide and diverse range of people who have tremendous experience and perspective on the issues that are the topic of conversation and the focus of the UN75 initiative. It's been quite an honor and privilege for Penelope and myself, if I could speak for both of us, to be part of the UN75 initiative. And we're very pleased to bring our perspective as researchers into this effort. Between our two organizations, we've looked at a variety of different data streams. As Fabrizio mentioned, there's more than one data stream informing UN75 initiative. In addition to the dialogues and the UN's own online survey, Penelope at Edelman has looked at public opinion and social media and media coverage of the UN and other issues, and we at the Pew Research Center have focused on the particulars of public attitudes in key UN donor countries. So together, Penelope and I are going to provide what we hope will be an empirical foundation for the discussion that the panelists and everyone on the call today is looking forward to have about the UN, its role in the world, and the future that we're all striving for. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Penelope.
Thank you, Jeb. The year of COVID. Slide. Next slide, please. No one has been unaffected by the pandemic. The research is clear. The number one priority for people at the moment is the pandemic.
I absolutely agree. We find the same thing looking at the data streams. Infectious disease, concerns about the spread of infectious disease, top concern, and people tell us amazing numbers of people have been directly impacted by the pandemic.
The pandemic has confirmed citizens' belief in the importance of global cooperation. Our survey shows that the majority believe the pandemic has made international cooperation even more urgent. Indeed, many feel that the UN is more important now in helping to tackle world issues as a result of it.
And I would add that we see something similar, but let us not take for granted the fact that coming as far as we have in dealing with the impact of the pandemic, that people are generally supportive of international cooperation, generally approving what the UN has done, because there are exceptions at the country level. Not all publics see this as a success story. And so the fact that a majority do is noteworthy in the findings that we are looking at, Penelope and I.
Global priorities for the future, hopes and fears. UN messaging of build back better and recover better resonate most across online and social media platforms. Citizens are ready to think about the future, and with that come both hopes and fears. Slide. Beyond the pandemic, tackling poverty and climate change are key. In the near term, people are clear about their immediate priorities. Increase support to the places hardest hit by the pandemic. This includes tackling health, poverty, inequalities, and boosting employment. People are actually hopeful that public health will improve and believe it will. They also believe access to education and women's rights are also on the right path and improving. But when looking further into the future, respondents' priorities shift to those areas where they believe things will get worse. Most participants across all regions are most worried about what climate change will do to our future. Our inability to stem the climate crisis and the destruction of our natural environment is the respondents' most overwhelming fear over the medium and long term.
And I would just like to reinforce what Penelope just said about the medium and long term. We've been tracking global threats and challenges for more than a decade at Pew. One of the more surprising discoveries from this current data is that across the data streams, the persistence of climate change as a top global threat, even in the context of COVID-19. Climate change has evolved to a sustained worldwide global concern.
The UN's capacity to create a brighter future. Slide. The UN is respected for its mission, but is not always seen as delivering results. In this year of COVID-19, the majority believe the UN has made the world a better place, and they see the UN as essential in tackling global challenges.
Absolutely. The UN receives credit for pursuing core elements of its mission, from ensuring peace and stability, to promoting human rights, to promoting sustainable development. And in 2020, many give the UN credit for promoting action on the pandemic and climate change.
And yet not everyone sees the UN delivering results. Just a third see the UN as contributing a lot to tackling global challenges.
And we similarly see a mixed report card on the UN helping to solve international problems.
But these are perceptions, and one factor to consider is how much citizens actually know about UN activities. The UN is only mentioned in 5% of global online coverage across the key issues of climate change, conflict and violence, shifting demographics, inequalities. Although in 2020, the UN does have a high profile in health coverage because of the World Health Organization and the pandemic.
And so, what about the future? What do people want from the UN as we look toward the future? Slide. And the key answers coming out of the data that Penelope and I have looked at are really threefold: inclusivity, transparency, and engagement. One of the most consistent findings for the UN75 data streams is the fact that people, citizens, feel the UN is aloof or remote. The UN's lowest ratings are for understanding the needs of ordinary citizens.
In terms of the UN we need, participants are calling for the organization to be more inclusive of a wide diversity of actors in the 21st century. Civil society, women, youth, vulnerable groups, cities and local authorities, businesses, regional organizations, and other international organizations.
And while all this is true and all this is focused on the United Nations, I think it's worth considering the degree to which calls for the UN to be more inclusive, more responsive to citizens' needs is actually particular or specific to the UN, or possibly it's a challenge for all multilateral organizations. By way of comparison, at Pew, when we've looked at how Europeans view the European Union, for example, the EU is given high marks for its core mission, and yet at the same time, fewer give the EU high marks for connecting with ordinary citizens. So connecting with citizens may be an endemic challenge of any or all multilateral organizations.
But whether the challenge of connecting with citizens is unique to the UN, can the UN meet the expectations and needs of the future? A call for innovation. People want the UN to innovate, to provide increased accountability, transparency, and impartiality, including through better engagement and communication with communities, as well as strengthening implementation of programs and operations. More broadly, people want the UN to demonstrate stronger leadership and more consistently exercise its moral authority to uphold the UN Charter.
And one piece of good news coming out of the UN75 data streams is that the UN apparently has very willing partners, especially among the young generation. Younger citizens are more supportive and more optimistic about the UN and its role, and more generally enthusiastic about international cooperation. This potentially is a resource that should not be overlooked.
And on that more upbeat note, we'll conclude our summary of key research findings and hand the microphone back to Fabrizio. And on both our behalves, I would like to say that we're so grateful for being part of the UN75 initiative, especially as we now turn from global challenges to global solutions.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'll hand straight over to Natalie, who's much more skilled at this than me.
Let's see about that. Thank you so much, Fabrizio, and thanks so much, Pen and Jeb, for taking us through the UN75 results in such a clear and compelling fashion, and also for giving us the benefit of your outsider perspective. It's quite a relief to hear that what you found in your independent studies also matches, broadly speaking, what we found in our consultation. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Natalie Samrasinger. I'm Chief of Strategy for the UN75 team, and I have the enormous privilege today of moderating our dialogue on the UN we need for the future we want. Our panelists today are well known in their fields, and they and their networks have really helped us to reach out to those who don't normally engage with the UN and to voices who are not often heard at the global level. I'm sure you're very familiar with them, so I will introduce them only briefly. I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Her Excellency Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, the first woman to hold that position, former High Commissioner for Human Rights, and now Chair of the Elders, and general all-round role model for women and girls and men and boys across the world. Thank you for joining us today. We then have Vanessa Nakata, who is really no less of a role model, She's the founder of Fridays for Future in Uganda and the Rise Up movement. And she has, really, I think, touched me personally by speaking out about racism in the media and the sort of coverage that activism gets. We're then delighted to have John Frank, the Vice President for UN Affairs at Microsoft, where he leads some fascinating work on multi-stakeholder solutions to the challenges we face and opportunities for computer and data scientists to help the UN. Microsoft has been a strong partner for UN75, and we thank you for your support. We have Anne Norgam, who's a long-standing member of the Sami Parliament of Finland and chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She's been working very hard to raise awareness of both the risks that COVID-19 poses to Indigenous peoples, but also their enormous potential to contribute to solutions. And last, but by no means least, we have Emilie Sais, the Secretary-General of our co-host today, United Cities and Local Government, who's really been, an indispensable partner for UN75, helping to engage cities across the world in our consultation. So thank you all for joining us. We're running a little bit late, so I'm going to just jump in there with the first question that I want to put to you all. So we've heard a lot about the results of the UN75 consultation, including the strong call for greater access to basic services, to tackle poverty and inequalities, climate action, for more global cooperation and more effective global cooperation. What resonated with you? Were the results as you would have expected? Did anything surprise you? And Mary, perhaps we can start with you. Let me just check you're on. Mary, I think you're still on mute. Do I hear Mary?
Mary is still on mute.
If not, Mary,
now.
Great.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Well, as I was saying, Natalie, I'm not really surprised because in a way, I had my own survey over 5 years when I was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and felt that the way to do the job was to go to the places of most serious conflict. And there I found people who really cared for human rights, who wanted to ensure that they could struggle for more equality, etc. And many of the issues responded to speak to that. I was pleased to hear Mayor Ada Colau talk about the fact that we need to struggle against all inequalities and to cooperate together to reach, as she said, a fairer and more feminist future. So I have to say I'm quite pleased to hear that. I'm particularly encouraged to see that the need for global solidarity and support for the hardest hit regions came out as top priorities in the global consultation. The pandemic has highlighted the deeply interconnected nature of our world and has made starkly visible the extent to which our own security is wholly dependent on the security of others. So it's therefore heartening that 87% of respondents to the consultation recognize that international cooperation is vital to dealing with today's challenges. But unfortunately, that's not the case with some of the most powerful global leaders, particularly the President of the United States. They haven't understood the need for global cooperation to tackle our common problems and have instead subjected the multilateral system to an unprecedented state of attack in recent years, much, much more than when I served in the UN. So this consultation sends a powerful message to leaders around the world about the kind of collaborative spirit that the world's people expect as we rebuild from the pandemic in the months and years ahead. And I'm also, I must say, very pleased to see that global inequality was an issue that came up prominently in the consultation. It's critical that the international system and the world leaders prioritize tackling inequality, both within and between countries, as a crucial component of ensuring a future for humanity based on peace, justice, and respect for human rights. The long-term drivers of inequality, including racial and gender discrimination, the legacy of colonialism, and inadequate economic opportunity, social safety nets, and workers' rights must be seriously addressed as part of this. So my last point is that COVID-19 has particularly exposed and exacerbated these inequalities. And it's critical that sufficient economic support is given to the global south as part of the recovery from the pandemic, and that action is taken to ensure universal access to medicines and vaccines against COVID-19.
Thanks so much, Mary. Perhaps I could ask a very quick follow-up. I read a recent statement by the elders about the collective failure of, I think of the world to articulate the benefits of effective multilateralism. And we saw that a little bit in the results where coverage of the UN is so low. But you mentioned, particular member states. I mean, how do you make that case as someone who has been, a head of state? How do you make that case to world leaders?
It's very interesting that the elders felt it necessary to issue such a strong statement of concern about our multilateral system. And what we are asking is for countries to defend the system, to call out others who are not defending it, and for the UN itself to give more leadership in calling out what is wrong at the moment about the undermining of the system. Now, it is particularly President Trump and at the federal level in the United States, but it's also other countries that are putting their country first, that are populist, that are not giving that kind of leadership, which the people clearly want. And we want countries that believe in the multilateral system to speak out more, to actually be more vocal. Let's not be too UN speak about all of this. Let's actually be brave. The elders are obviously very independent, but we would like other countries to be more independent as we go forward in knowing that this is not going to get us to a better future, and we have to call out those who are not meeting their responsibilities.
Thanks so much, Mary. Vanessa, I'd like to turn to you, your take on the results. And also what I found, striking is Jeb and Penn mentioned this optimism amongst young people, a belief in international cooperation in the UN. But of course, you've been calling for much, much more action on climate change. So be interested in your thoughts on the results.
Thank you so much, Natalie. When I read the report, I want to say that most of the things didn't surprise me, because there are things that are happening now, there are things that are visible right now. We clearly saw from this pandemic how it exacerbated the inequalities that people are already experiencing, especially those in the most affected communities in the global south. We saw many people lack access to basic needs. For example, in my country, I would see women for the government pleading to get some food for their children. So I feel like post this pandemic, there is so much that was talked about in the report that needs to be done, making sure that people have access to the necessities of life, like health facilities, having access to housing, having access to food. You realize that even in this pandemic, people experienced the climate crisis. People were faced with climate disasters from India to East Africa with the rising floods. And many of them who had to stay at home to keep safe from the virus were left homeless. So that really resonated with me. And I think it's really important that countries look into it, and also support to the most affected. Many times we talk about people and how they are really affected the most, but we never see help coming out to these people. We never see adequate support coming out to these people. And this support shouldn't just be humanitarian. It should start from the actions that we are doing. Because if you are doing actions that are leading these people to live us in such uncomfortable and dangerous situations, then when they face those challenges, you come and bring support and everyone calls you a hero. I think that is something that needs to end. If we are to help the most affected communities, it has to start from the root causes and stopping the challenges or the activities that are putting them in worse situations. I was also really captured by the education of girls. I think that if we want to save the world, then we should educate girls. I believe there is so much potential in educating girls. We have seen very many women leaders and how they have handled this pandemic. But this has been possible because they have had an education. I believe that when we educate more girls, then we will have a more safer world. We will have a more sustainable world. And I also think this is something that is lacking in environmental circles. Environmental circles need to start embracing educating girls as the great solution to fighting the climate crisis, because an educated girl will make better decisions. These are tomorrow's leaders, these are tomorrow's campaigners, these are tomorrow's scientists. They will know best how to take care of the planet, but they can only get these things from school. So I want environmental circles to start talking about educating girls as the next technological solution to reducing global warming and fighting the climate crisis, because it makes them more resilient, it makes their families more resilient, and it also makes their countries more resilient. And also, yeah, I really resonated with the worry of the climate crisis. Many people are worried about these disasters. People need to understand that the worries of people are because the catastrophes are happening now. Many times we talk about climate change in these conferences as if it's something that is coming in the future, and yet it is something that is happening right now. So when people say that they are worried, that means they are really worried. They're experiencing the impacts now. For people in the global south, climate change is not coming in the future. Climate change is happening right now. It's a matter of their survival, not a matter of securing a better future, because the present itself is already catastrophic enough. And I also want to talk about the international cooperation. This pandemic has shown that if we are to get over all these disasters and challenges, we need global cooperation. We need to work together, because at the end of it all, we all depend on the life support systems of this earth. We all have to work together to ensure that no child has to sleep hungry, to ensure that no girl child is forced into marriage, to ensure that communities don't face violence. We all have to work together to make sure that these things happen. And also the inclusion of women and vulnerable groups in decision making in these platforms. I think it's also important. Speaking from a climate related perspective, women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, from the global south again. These are the people who are charged with providing food for their families, providing water for their families, taking care of their children. So the fact that they are responsible for all these chores at home, they must be included in the decision making, because they understand how best they can protect their families. And that inclusion should start from educating girls and young women. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vanessa, about that important reminder of educating girls and empowering girls and women as an enabler to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and for climate action. And also of the fact that should be obvious to everyone that climate change is happening now. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to go now to John. What struck you when you read the results?
Yeah, first, let me just comment on the importance of listening. And what struck me is really the process, in a sense. In today's world, through the internet, we all have more voice and more reach, but our capacity to listen hasn't necessarily matched our capacity to speak out. And so I think it's incredibly important, the initiative of the UN leadership to listen, and the opportunity for us to learn from the report and what we hear. The challenges caused by the pandemic reflected in the results are enormous. And as Fabrizio said, the multilateral systems are under stress and challenged. We have more challenges than we have solutions. I do think it's important, though, to remind ourselves that when we work together, we can do well. I think it's nice to remember that the World Food Program was recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee this year, precisely because it's continued to operate so well during the pandemic, feeding 90 million people a day. And so that's incredibly important. But if we're candid, the challenges are unmet in many other areas. And I think we need to look for new ways and new technologies to help address them. It is important, I think, that at this General Assembly of the United Nations, for the first time, all member states committed to, in the anniversary declaration, to improve digital cooperation. And so I think that, you know, there is a sense that digital is part of our 21st century world. But if we look at the experience of the pandemic across all countries, rich and poor, the digital divide has been more significant in this incredibly difficult period. And so we need to address the digital divide. And when we think about building back better, we should be looking for, we can't say we're going to rebuild the economy, then get around to digital. Digital is an opportunity as a foundation for building back better, to create better jobs, better skills, better education, better healthcare that we can take advantage of. And there's also an opportunity, I think, for technology to help the UN and its agencies become more effective. Certainly the World Health Organization is making major investments in technology to apply the best computer and data science to be smarter about world health situation. So I think that there are opportunities. You know, we should feel good about some of, you know, our successes as well, but there's no doubt about it. There's so much more work to do to make global cooperation fully effective to address the incredible needs that are highlighted in the survey.
Thanks, John. If I can ask you a very quick follow-up. I mean, I think one message that emerged from the consultation was that people didn't really want, you know, to go back to normal, because normal wasn't really working for most people in the world, probably. And just building on your comments on technology, I mean, we framed access to basic services in terms of health, education, etc. And we had a sort of separate question on digital. I mean, would you now call access to digital technology a basic service?
I would. I think that, you know, if you're not connected to the, you know, being connected to the world right now is more important than ever. And I think that creating that connectivity is a technology solution, an economic solution, but it's also a priority. You know, if we're going to make it a priority to actually get people connected, we can do it. And it's not just getting, you know, getting frequencies to people and getting bits to people. It's getting the services to people. You know, it is using the power of technology for education, for healthcare, to increase job skills and increase the earning capacity, especially of women around the world. So there's tremendous potential, but we've got to make it a priority.
Thanks, John. Anne, welcome, and thank you for waiting so patiently. I'd love to hear your take, your perspective on the findings, perhaps also among some of the communities you work with.
Thank you. I was surprised and pleased with finding 6. The young and those in developing countries are more optimistic about the future. While this is promising, key finding 1 noted the need for more equitable access to education for all and investment in youth. When it comes to indigenous youth, culturally relevant and sensitive education is paramount. And accessibility to education in indigenous languages is also of a great importance. And as the previous panelist said, access to digital services as a right would improve this greatly. And education is key for preserving indigenous people's traditions and building their future. And the challenge is to balance this with mainstream education systems, which has been used as a form of assimilation into national societies. It is also important to provide instruction in indigenous languages as key to strengthen and revitalize indigenous languages. It is hoped that this will be translated to action during the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And the decade starts 22 and lasts until 32. In addition, data has revealed that a pattern of persisting disparities between indigenous peoples and the non-indigenous populations exists in all regions of the world with respect to educational access, retention, and achievement. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anna. And finally, Emilia, how did you, receive the results, and how did they match with the findings from your own consultation?
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Actually, I was thinking back that when we started to look at the question of what we wanted the future to look like, we started to do videos, and COVID had not hit it as hard yet. We were at the very beginning of the year, we were considering these questions. And when I look back at those videos, actually the hopes and dreams expressed by the local leaders that we interviewed were very similar to those that are being expressed today and that Mayor Colau has shared. And actually that shows that the priorities have not shifted that much. And that is what I see also in the results. Of course, when I read the report, I was a little bit biased because I was looking at it from the perspective of local governments. This will not come to you as a surprise. And what I was particularly happy with is how much people understood the importance of the public service, the public service provision. Public is really back in the game. And it is very important to realize that if we actually want to shift some of the decision making that we have been doing. I fully agree that with John that we cannot wait around to build economy and then look at the digital divide. We can also not rebuild economy and then wait until we achieve equality or achieve a new generation of rights. And some the surveys have shown us actually that people were experiencing crisis and acknowledging some of their own situations much more as crisis than governments give them credit to. For instance, the climate emergency is experienced by people as a true crisis and emergency, much broader than many governments have made. And that is also the case for the housing crisis, for instance. And I would add the digital divide. We live in a world that does not acknowledge that most of it, over 40% of it, is working in an informal economy. That is also a crisis. If you don't acknowledge such a big part of your reality, it will be very hard to get back to develop a better normal. So the whole building back better would be in danger. And I think the results of the survey go in these directions, and they are also pointing us the priorities that we need to focus on. So I keep that for the next round. But overall, a very hopeful results, also showing us that there are false discourses that are forcing us into dichotomies that people in general do not really agree with. For instance, the dichotomy between the urban and the rural, the dichotomy between the local and the global. It is true that nowadays when you perceive problems, there seems to be either very global or very local, and there seems to be nothing in between. But that is not a dichotomy. It's just a very tight linkage between local reality and global reality, which makes it extremely important for us to work in those two levels at the very same time.
Thanks so much, Emilia. I do like the slogan, "Public is back." That's a good T-shirt, I think, for UCLG in the future. I want to, you hinted at it, lots of others did as well. I want to get into the impact of these results, and we've already had a question from Mafalda Borea about that. I mean, how can and will these results impact our strategy going forward? We already heard a great, caution there from Vanessa saying, really focus on girls' education as an enabler. But thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, climate action, other areas of your work, what lessons can we draw on these findings? How do we take them forward? And John, I'm going to start with you. You are the only man on this panel, and I don't want to be accused of leaving you out. So let's start with you this time.
myself off mute. Well, I think we need to look for new ways to address these challenges. This is the 21st century, we're a new world. And the traditional national government system is wonderful, but it has limitations. We've not solved the major challenges facing us. And there's an opportunity to be more inclusive in how we tackle problems. On climate change, we can't just look for national governments. Certainly local, state, regional governments have taken a lead in pursuing climate action in the United States. Companies are taking action. Everybody, we all share this responsibility. We just can't wait for others to do it. And I think we need to look for new models of cooperation between governments and civil society and the private sector to build solutions. Democratically elected governments are, they are the representatives of the people. And they play an incredibly important role in structuring our societies. But being more inclusive about working on the problems, we can get, I think, better outcomes. Certainly, at Microsoft, our commitments about being net zero carbon by 2030, and then by 2050, being net neutral for the 75-year history of the company at that point. We're committed to carbon recapture. We're also committed to working with UN agencies and other companies to learn as we go, because this isn't we're all in this together. So I think that looking for multi-stakeholder solutions to problems is an incredibly important opportunity. And I think that there's no shortage of need to act. And so I think that would be where I'd begin.
And that was a really, I think, resounding message from our consultation as well. And I might jump to you, Anne. I mean, you got a little bit into this in your comments earlier. How can we build on these findings?
Thanks. Indigenous peoples, in particular, Indigenous women and girls, are often disproportionately affected by epidemics and other crises. Indigenous peoples are nearly 3 times as likely to be living in extreme poverty as their non-Indigenous counterparts. They account for almost 19% of the extreme poor, irrespective of the region and residents in rural and urban areas, and even across international borders. So, for example, in our Nordic countries, the figures are about the same. Indigenous peoples also have higher rates of non-communicable and infectious diseases. Many Indigenous communities are also defenseless against new diseases, particularly those in voluntary isolation. The pandemic has affected them disproportionately, exacerbating already existing structural and institutional discrimination and marginalization. Governments and respective institutions must include Indigenous peoples' representatives, leaders, and traditional authorities in emergency and health entities in their communities, overseeing responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Indigenous peoples should be included in both responses to the pandemic as well as to its social and economic impacts and recovery efforts. Culturally appropriate responses and traditional Indigenous healthcare practitioners should be trained in all relevant measures and use of equipment. Governments must also ensure improved access and management of clean water and sanitation, particularly for Indigenous peoples living in remote communities, to avoid further spread of the virus. The UN system should support projects to make accessible mental health and psychosocial support available to Indigenous persons, particularly adolescents and young people, as well as ensure access to remote learning opportunities, including low-tech and no-tech options for children and young people affected by school closures. And I'd also like to invite Microsoft company to work with us when it comes to these issues. That would be very helpful for all the indigenous peoples tackling the difficult situations. Thank you.
Well, we'll do our best if we can connect you after this as well. You know, it's always good to use an opportunity like this. If I could ask maybe the speakers to be a little bit brief in their next answers, just because we also have a number of reflections from some of our permanent missions here. I think there's a couple of youth that would like to make some comments, and of course, everyone watching can ask comments via the Q&A function. So grateful for some brevity. I will go now to Vanessa. How do you think you might be able to make use of the results? How might we be able to make use of the results to support what you're doing?
Well, thank you so much. I think what we need to first get from these findings is the fact that our societies are vulnerable, and the fact that millions of people face injustices, millions of people face different challenges, inequalities that we are able to address. So I hope that we can build on that to make this world a better place for everyone. We may be facing the same storm in this world, but we are in different boats. We may be experiencing the climate crisis, but there are communities that are facing its wrath in more catastrophic ways that are affecting their livelihoods, the livelihoods of their children. And this really needs to be looked into if we want to be able to work on these findings. You realize everything is so interconnected. There is an intersection with every sustainable development goal. You realize that if we educate girls, we'll be able to reduce poverty, we'll be able to reduce zero hunger, we'll be able to fight climate change. And again, if we take the actions towards sustainability, we'll be able to eradicate poverty, because climate change is pushing millions of people into more poverty and keeping them in poverty traps. So when you realize the intersection of all these sustainable development goals, from gender equality to peace and building to partnerships, you realize that everything is connected. We are all connected. And if we want to survive the wrath that we are seeing in our world right now, we have to work together. And then also, there are different kinds of projects and different kinds of activities that millions of young people are doing to drive change in their communities. But most of these activities need funding, they need support, they need to be pushed. I believe that every activist is able to drive change in their communities, but they are limited by resources. So if there is any way that the activists can be supported, platforming them and enabling them tell their stories and also support their projects, we will be able to achieve change in communities. I believe that if we add together millions of actions, support millions of small activities in different parts of the world, we will be able to transform this world and make it a better place for everyone. And I would also like to request Microsoft to support activists in the Global South. Personally, I'm working on a project that involves the installation of solar panels and eco-friendly stoves in schools as a way of driving transition to renewable energy, as a way of reducing on the amount of firewood that schools use in a term. In my country, all the schools use firewood for preparation of food, and they don't have any other options. We only have to provide alternatives that reduce on the amount of that firewood. And so far, we have done implementation in 6 schools and hoping that we can cover as many schools as possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And John, the requests are piling up for you. I'm going to go to Emilia and see how she wants to take this forward as well. I don't know if you also have a request to Microsoft, Emilia, but the floor is yours.
I'm sure that my members have many requests for Microsoft, but that's part of another conversation. I do think that in the future, the conversation between the private sector and the public sector will need to evolve. And I know that a lot of efforts have been made actually to make that conversation progress. But in a time where this digital divide needs to be addressed, we will need to actually look at the public sector not only as consumers of technology, but defining technology more deeply. But I wanted to go back to the issue of what can we do with this. I think that different actors need to take different responsibilities. I think that public sector needs to acknowledge their responsibility in addressing some of the concerns that citizens have expressed, such as the weakness of institutions, the mistrust that some of the citizens feel, the existing corruption. We need to take that responsibility. We need to address that. It is extremely important, and we need to listen indeed. And it's funny because when we talk as cities to the United Nations, we ask them to listen to cities. When we talk among ourselves, we say cities are listening, because our greatest wealth is actually hear what the citizens need. So we need to take that responsibility. We also need to ask national governments to take responsibility and to acknowledge that if over 70% of the targets that need to be met under the SDGs, under the 17 SDGs, are dependent on local service provision, we will need to give a higher priority to that service provision, to the financing of it, but also to creating the capacities in local governments to meet that. That is what we call localizing the SDGs, which is also coming up in the chat. We can make it happen if we make sure that those services reach everywhere at a local level. And then finally, the international community. The international community also needs to take responsibility. And I very much agree with Ms. Robinson. We need to learn to talk with each other in a different way. It's not always about agreeing. We need to listen to each other also when we disagree. And these multilateral platforms need to actually make us come closer together, not just listen in parallel to where we stand. And if that is something that we need to meet, we will need to include communities, civil society, and all stakeholders in a different way in this conversation. So how to transform this is by each of us as actors with different roles, taking responsibility, ownership of the results of the survey, and transform them into actionables.
Thanks so much, Emilia. And I'll give the final word to Mary in this round.
Thank you. And I just want to build on the excellent points made by my fellow panelists. Let me begin by saying that it's critical that the positive momentum of the survey and also generated by the UN75 declaration of member states isn't lost. And given that the only concrete decision in the declaration is to request the UN Secretary-General to report back to member states with recommendations, I would particularly encourage the Secretary-General to take advantage of this opportunity to put forward an ambitious agenda for strengthening the United Nations in the years ahead. He has the people behind him, people power. Secondly, I agree very much with the points made about opening up the multilateral system to be less top-down and to be more bottom-up and top-down together and connected, and to link to the powerful voices. And by powerful, I mean the young voices as well, people like Vanessa and so many young people addressing the existential threat of the climate crisis. But the private sector has to change. We can't go back to business as usual. It has to change out of fossil fuel. It has to change to a reset, not to be thinking only about shareholder power and accountability to shareholder, but also to wider stakeholders, to the workers, to the communities affected by the private sector. So we need that kind of restructuring. And then we do need greater multilateral action to tackle the key existential threats posed by the climate crisis and indeed by nuclear weapons. If I take the climate crisis, you know, next year is going to be the year leading up to COP26 when we need the ambition. We are beginning to see some ambition. China committed to by 2050 it will have by 2060 it will have zero emissions. Japan has just announced that it will have zero emissions by 2050. The EU is saying that and trying to actually become more ambitious with reducing by 55% emissions by 2030, which is, you know, really good leadership. We need more of that. COVID has taught us that we are, you know, in a very fragile state as a human race. We can be completely turned upside down by a virus we can't even see. And therefore, we're interconnected. And what we do matters. And we must do it together in a much greater multilateral spirit. I know we're out of time for long answers, so I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Barry. It's always worth listening to you. I'm going to take some quick reflections now from some of the permanent missions who've joined us, and if we have time, also some of the youth participants, and be very fair and go in alphabetical order. I would like to invite now Her Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Afghanistan, who I believe is on the line, to make some comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues, for the invitation. This was a very enriching conversation. I learned and a lot, and I think this reflection helps us even further to prepare ourselves on how we should make sure that the UN is effective, that our roles as PRs are more constructive, and it strengthens the institution that we strongly believe. I think the survey and the findings of the study is at the odds that we are, it's still very encouraging that there is belief, there is trust in the multilateralism, in the international order and at the UN. But of course, as a reflection of the panelists, distinguished panelists, and what they discussed, that it's not easy times. It's a very difficult time. COVID-19 at the beginning, which we all thought is going to bring us together because it's going to make the relevancy of the UN even more important. It was expected and it was assumed, but the trends we see, it unfortunately has turned to become more political, and it has created further challenges at the UN. A fresh thought that we have to think more carefully, and I think you all talked about the digital divide, you've talked about the inequality, you have talked about the climate change, and I think one thing else I wanted to add, and it's so quick and it's going to come so soon in front of us, and it will create even more greater division and will make the division even more bigger and more bolder in front of our eyes. It is the vaccine distribution. I think we're just going to see it, and not too long ago it's going to arrive, how it's going to be distributed, and we know that for sure there won't be equal distribution, and that will create even greater divisions economically, socially, and that divide we speak, it's going to be even more bigger. It will impact economies, and I think we just have to prepare. This is the dark side, but on the brighter side, I think, and there is something we have to take advantage of it, and we have always undermined, but it's the role and the responsibilities of the government, which I agree. It's the GA, the role of the GA. We have always so heavily relied on the Security Council, which, correct, it does play a really important role on how do we see the strength of the UN. But there is the strength of the GA that somehow we have not really utilized effectively. I think there is a greater majority within the UN that believes exactly in the values that everyone discussed today and here. And you said it's individual responsibility that we have to think beyond our national policies. Our national policies in a lot of places probably would be different, but in most of the issues we think the same, and that's the strength of this institution. So it's upon us again how we work together. It's upon us how we take the leadership. A lot of time, I think we think of few to take the leadership, but I think in this times, in this very odd situation, in this very challenging situation, we have to think more collectively, leadership together and with all of us. We still have very strong and unique voices. Mary Robinson's is among them. There are countries that come with very stronger strength. And I think we have to tap on that. We have to create the narrative that we're building, and we should make it even more bigger, that there should be no space for countries, even if they feel uncomfortable, they must join that narrative. And that's, again, the relevancy, the effectiveness, and the strength of the United Nations. It must be the UN that it should address the challenges. We foresee it's coming in our life. Some are so quick, so fast, within a few months it will arrive on us. And some will take a little bit more time, and some are already happening. These are my very quick and very humble reflection, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity. But I once again want to echo what all of you said. We need to work together. We need to get out of populist ideas. We need to believe in the strength of multilateralism. And there is the good news is, despite sometimes here we get under the shadow of pessimism, but the good news is there is a majority out there that believes and echoes exactly what we all say. I'm going to stop here and thank you all for this wonderful and this humbling experience and opportunity to be among all of you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and also actually for touching on the role of the General Assembly. We've seen that in the Security Council come up a little bit in our questions, so I thank you for that. I'm now delighted to turn to the distinguished representative from Lesotho. We look forward to your responses and comments on what you've heard from our panelists.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and let me start by really appreciating and thanking everybody for the invitation to this very enlightening and very informative, very educative session. May I just quickly say that one is in almost complete agreement with the observations or the findings that have been put through here. But that beyond those observations, maybe the underlying factor is that the lesson that has been learned from COVID-19 is that of the need for global cooperation, the need for acting as one. And in this particular respect, when you're thrown back to the question of, well, if we go back to the existential threat that existed which led to the formation of the United Nations, have this gone away? One recalls that when the pandemic really set in, there was general talk and general observation that we are going to a new world order. Has that come up? Have we seen any emergence of a new world order, which is more productive, which is more progressive, which is more leading towards working together? Or have we seen the re-emergence of the destructive race for global dominance, a destructive race for what is sometimes termed leadership, but which is really a question of domination and a question of that kind of arrangement where for instance, major issues like security, major issues like peace are not universally accepted as principles beyond the weight of acceptance as principles, but are determined by a few, accepted as being determined by a few. So maybe one would like to put in an additional word here in terms of saying, if we are going to progress, maybe we need some introspection. And that introspection starting from nationally. How committed are we? How genuine are we to the principles that bring us to New York? to the discussions that we have in New York, to the resolutions and the recommendations and the declarations that we make in New York. We have a splendid document here in terms of the declaration that has been so aptly worked on by, among others, my colleague here, Alia here. But just how genuine are we to this recommendation? Have we come to a situation where invariably we find that we are such good environmentalists? What do I mean by that? That the question of resolutions, the question of recommendations, the question of declarations has become more a question of recycling. How many of the resolutions that we have here are recycled over the years? For instance, matters on security, the Security Council. How many of those have been recycled over the years? Questions of decolonization, how many are we recycling every year? And now we have this question of climate change, and hopefully that perhaps we should move beyond just making those recommendations, making those declarations, and then move more towards a topical issue in this particular instance. When we talk about peace and security, for instance, only a few days ago, the TPNW reached that historic mark of on the 50 that makes it be ready to come into force. And no sooner had that happened, we were going into the phase now of cohesive calls for unratification of that particular. So what is going to happen here? Of course, it's going to be ongoing discussion about, not about peace, not about how we move towards peace, but about that ratified treaty. Yeah. So it is perhaps a question there of saying, how do we move beyond the question of recycling our wonderful declarations and going to be genuinely moving towards making sure that we're going to into peaceful coexistence here. And maybe one could perhaps borrow some words from somebody in trying to top up this thing here, which I thought were very profound. And they read, rivers don't drink their own waters. Trees do not eat their own fruit. The sun does not shine on itself, and flowers do not spread their fragrance for themselves. Living for others is the rule of nature. We are all born to help each other. No matter how difficult it is, life is good when you are happy, but much better when others are happy because of you. That is multilateralism. That is the spirit that we should be moving on. And it is only proper that indicate where the quotation comes from. It is from an Argentinian who is leading one of the smallest countries on the states on the planet, and that is Pope Francis. So multilateralism, an Argentinian in Italy leading a small state. Let us leave no one behind. But these are profound words that I thought maybe should capture that spirit of multilateralism that we should be genuinely working on. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those moving words and reflections, and also for mentioning the TPNW, which was a big development this week. I'm going to completely break with protocol because I want to hear at least from one youth voice, but this is not a formal UN meeting, so I think I'm allowed to do that. I'd like to go to Enise Tamori from Together First, and then I believe the Ambassador of Qatar has rejoined us, and we can go to Qatar and Palestine. But let's hear from one member of civil society first, seeing as so many comments have been about inclusion from the panel today.
Thank you, Natalie, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity, especially to reiterate the point that this UN75 process can really serve as a launch pad for real action, and particularly action that facilitates new partnerships for civil society and means that civil society can have a seat at the decision-making table. We just heard about the TPNW, this wonderful birthday present for the UN, and it's really a landmark moment on the path to a nuclear-free world that has been the product of tireless civil society campaigning. Without ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, along with other campaigners and activists over the years, this integral success wouldn't have been possible. And their role highlights what an important partner civil society is in bringing about real policies that make this world safer, and importantly, how well civil society can work with member states. And so since 2018, Together First, the campaign I represent, has been advocating that civil society holds the solutions we need to mitigate these global risks, such as climate change, killer robots, and indeed nuclear weapons. So earlier this year, we produced a to-do list for world leaders, 10 proposals that came about from a year-long global consultation, and critically among this list, which I encourage you all to look at, and I will share a link to it, we have a proposal for the Secretary-General to appoint a UN civil society champion. This is a proposal that is supported already by the likes of Civicus, Human Rights Watch, the Igarapi Institute, and others, because it's been mentioned that the UN75 survey showed that over 70% of people believe the UN is essential to our future. Well, we know that civil society is essential to the UN, essential in making sure it is fair, accountable, and critically has that legitimacy that it needs to be an effective organization and leader when it comes to finding these multilateral solutions we need in the face of global crises. As Mary Robinson noted, the UN75 declaration mandates that the Secretary-General comes up with a reform agenda by the end of the 75th session, and to report back to the General Assembly next September. So while we applaud all of the efforts that have taken place in this 75th year, and the report and all the work of your team, Natalie, we really think that this is a vital moment, that the largest ever global conversation becomes a moment for real change, for real action, and is a time that civil society can actually be brought into the decision-making table where it really urgently needs to be. So that was all I wanted to say, and I kind of was going to put a question, but I think we probably don't have time. But I'm going to share the links to this report that makes the case for this, and I encourage those that get behind this idea to endorse it, please.
Thanks so much, and I'm glad we got at least one youth comment in there. But I'm delighted now, and I believe she's back, to hand over to the ambassador of Qatar, who was so instrumental in shepherding the UN75 declaration. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and of course my thanks goes to Under Secretary General Fabrizio Hochschild for this opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm delighted to speak after one of our youth representatives. And of course, let me begin by giving my sincere appreciation to the President of the General Assembly who set the tone in this panel today with his insightful opening remarks. Let me share some of my thoughts. Of course, I very much welcome the Secretary General report to the future we want, the United Nations we need, which reflects important recommendations from the global conversation, of course, about the global challenges and the future we are headed towards. Of course, the political declaration of the UN 75th anniversary, which I had the pleasure, of course, of co-facilitating with my dear colleague and friend Ambassador Karen Enstrom, the permanent representative of Sweden to the UN. The declaration is again simple, concise, and forward-looking, unifying declaration that captures the collective commitment of member states to multilateralism and to the United Nations. Most importantly, the overall aim of the declaration was to be understood and to be owned and championed by the people. That was the main purpose during the drafting process. Throughout the declaration negotiation process, of course, which happened at the most difficult times when we were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, There were differences of views among member states and among major groups of countries. However, there was an overwhelming support for reinvigorated and more inclusive multilateralism, and the belief that working together is the key to overcoming the current pandemic and building back better, as well as tackling other side and produce a declaration that reflects the hopes of the people to help build a better future. It is important to note that we also we gathered inputs from diverse stakeholders from across the global civil society organizations. I mean, we had a number of engagements with CSOs and young people throughout the process while we were negotiating the draft with member states. The declaration, of course, includes 12 action points to respond to the pandemic, climate change, inequality, conflict, the disruptive use of technologies, and build upon and complement, and of course, these action points build upon and complement one another. Most importantly, the declaration also calls on member states to align their recovery efforts with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the, of course, Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, key frameworks for recovery and building back better and greener. These commitments very much mirror the top 10 key findings of the Secretary-General report. Both outline the most critical and pressing issues and point the need for a strengthened cooperation to address a particular global problem. Just to give a few examples, of course, for instance, member states agreed that we should not neglect our past international commitments, in particular the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the Secretary-General report notes the improved access to basic services, healthcare, safe water and sanitation, and education as a priority for respondents of all origins. Greater international solidarity to tackle poverty, inequality, and boost employment, a top priority in the report, is reflected as well in the declaration commitment to build trust. Ensuring, of course, greater respect for human rights and settling conflicts is reflected in member states' commitments to promote peace and prevent conflict. One final example is the commitment to boost partnerships and make the United Nations more inclusive and engaged with all relevant stakeholders. This is reflected in the Secretary-General report, with respondents calling for the UN to be more inclusive and the need for greater inclusion of civil society, youth, and the private sector. The critical concluding language of the declaration will help ensure that the UN system, with the continued substantive inputs from all stakeholders, is mobilized to put forward effective follow-through action plans to ensure the full realization of the declaration 12 concrete commitments. I will stop here, and again, thank you very much for this very, very insightful, engaging dialogue.
Thank you, Ambassador, so much. We're so pleased you could make it. I would like to now give the floor to the distinguished representative from Palestine for our last reflection, and then I'm going to come back to the panel for some super quick responses.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm honored to join you all as we commemorate UN Day and the UN 75th anniversary, while also reflecting on the global conversation launched by Under-Secretary-General Hochschild and his UN 75 team for this purpose. Thank you. The State of Palestine is proud to be included in this initiative, joining the family of nations and sharing our views, fears, and hopes for the future. I was personally struck by the UN 75 survey's main finding that, as many have pointed out, our world is not as divided as we would be led to believe at this moment by rising geopolitical tensions and the loud and hostile populism and extremism we witness in so many places that makes us feel the world is hopelessly fractured. That this is not actually the case, that the people of the world see things less as us versus them and more as we the peoples, interconnected and with common vulnerabilities and aspirations, is such an important finding. And as all have said, serious efforts are needed by all stakeholders, governments, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, the private sector, and concerned citizens and communities everywhere, based on those commonalities and aimed at bringing tangible change to create a better, more peaceful, just, and prosperous future for all. As we seek to strengthen international cooperation, we continue to see the UN as central and stress the importance of working together to ensure the UN we want and need, and a UN that is relevant for all. I've often said that while in some countries UN news may not turn heads, for Palestinians, the UN is always headline news. It is not abstract. It is our lived reality, part of our history, and ever present in our daily lives and continuing struggle in ways big and small, and both negative and positive, a tension that I believe was also reflected in the UN75 report. Many Palestinians perceive the UN as the source of the injustice we are living due to the General Assembly's decision in 1947 to partition historic Palestine. But at the same time, for many, the UN is the guarantor of the justice and rights we seek, and that which alleviates hardships pending achievement of a just solution. UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees in particular, is pivotal in the lives of 5.6 million refugees, providing them with education, healthcare, social and emergency assistance, which for many is life-sustaining and for some even transformative, providing hope and opportunity, which are so crucial for confronting the despair that poverty, hunger, and human insecurity breed, and averting its dangerous consequences. That UN agency is indeed exemplary of the humanitarian development and peace work that the UN is known for and needed for around the world. Interestingly, these life necessities, access to healthcare, water, sanitation, and education, were identified in the UN75 survey as the most immediate concern for the majority of respondents, especially against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, they are among the most vital components of a safe and dignified life, and reaffirm the necessity and impact of the humanitarian assistance the UN provides worldwide. It is significant also that the survey found human rights and resolution of conflicts to be among the major priorities, a finding that correlates with the abiding conviction of the Palestinian people in the UN's critical role in international law, the rules-based order, and multilateralism. And this belief remains at the core of our appeals to the international community to live up to its promises and responsibilities in line with the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter, including in defense of the equality of all people and the inalienable right to self-determination. As the report highlights, the fears are many, and yet so are the hopes, even amongst the most vulnerable and deprived. And I do believe that Palestine is a testament to that. Although the survey, due to the digital divide, may not have captured in full their voices, the voices heard confirm that hope has not been lost and that resilience remarkably persists, even in this time of global pandemic, but also that the UN at 75 still has a lot of work to do. Millions continue to look to the UN in partnership with their governments to remedy the crises we are facing, prepare us for the challenges that lay ahead, and bring forth that better future where no one is left behind and where the humanity, worth, and dignity of all are respected, where women and youth are included in the conversation and the solutions crafted, and where lasting peace, justice, and stability can prevail. And to conclude, I would believe that for that to happen, it is imperative for the UN to consistently uphold the Charter and its moral authority. Failings in that regard have harmed the UN's credibility in the eyes of the people, and the case of Palestine is a striking example and often referred to as the litmus test of the UN's efficacy and affinity to its Charter. And that is why we continue to appeal to the UN, this pillar of the international community, to live up to those noble principles and purposes. And we pledge our cooperation to continue our efforts in cooperation with the entire family of nations towards achieving the UN we want and we need. And again, I thank you all for this opportunity to include our voice in this very important conversation.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. And we hope we can continue to work with you and indeed others to make sure that those who are to date underrepresented in our surveys can still be heard. We have until the end of the year. I'm going to go back to the panel, not with a final question, but with a chance for you all to make one final point on the condition that you can make it in about 10 to 15 seconds, and maybe pick one of the themes that you've heard to respond to, whether that's the point about inclusion of youth or civil society, the role of states in taking forward this agenda. I mean, we've heard a lot today, reflections on peace and security. I will leave it up to you. And I would like to start, if I may, with Vanessa. So one concluding thought, please.
Thank you so much. I believe that if we want to see a happy people and a happy planet, we have to move towards a future that is healthy, livable, equitable, and sustainable for all of us. And that is by addressing the injustices that different people face, the inequalities that they face, and working to ensure that everyone is protected, the ecosystems are protected, the planet is protected. So my final word is for us to move towards an equitable and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anne, your final 10 seconds.
Thank you, Natalie. The finding 9 on inclusion is reflected in a very recent report of the Secretary-General on enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in meetings of relevant UN nations bodies on issues affecting them. And when we talk about building future together, the United Nations together, as a trusted partner of the member states, must insist that indigenous peoples have a seat at the table at the global and the country level, so we can work with you to address important challenges that affect all of us, such as climate change, environmental degradation, and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And John, your 10-second final words.
Well, the challenges are great, but I think it's especially important that we view these challenges as a call to action and renew our ambitions. The UN leadership has done a great job advancing this. We all need to support and join in to address the challenges.
Thanks so much, John. Emilia, your final words?
Yeah, there is no single level or sphere of government, no single country, no single actor that can face these challenges alone. And the seat at the global table that local and regional governments are claiming for needs to be the seat of communities. It's with them that we need to reach a more inclusive multilateral system. And inclusivity can be actually quite simple, just listening to these stakeholders every year in a structural manner, accepting our reports and building on our recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Mary, I give the final words to you.
Well, Natalie, when Nelson Mandela brought the elders together in 2007, he asked us to work on peace and human rights and sustainable development. But he said, above all, bring hope. And the interesting thing is about this survey, it is a survey full of the hopes of people. It's very positive in its impact. And as you said, I'm not surprised that people do want to have their basic needs met, which are in fact their basic rights. There's something very reassuring about the fact that people want the multilateral system to work. They want it to be more inclusive, et cetera, all of the things that we've been talking about. I want the UN Secretary-General now to take this forward in responding to the UN Declaration with a strong series of recommendations to pull all this together and to actually put it up to member states that the UN is going to be stronger and better able to lead in a very bumpy period, admittedly, but still one where the UN is absolutely vital. And just one more point on the point that the Ambassador of Afghanistan made, we do need an approach to the people's vaccine, not vaccine for the rich. That's a really important point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary, and a huge thanks to all of you. I really wish we had more time. Thanks to everyone who offered reflections, questions. Thanks to everyone for joining. The UN75 initiative, it really has been about listening. We heard that many times to the world's people. We have listened. We need to act now, and that of course depends on member states, but also on all of us. So we will conclude now with some very eloquent words from Thomas Bach, who's a former Olympian and president of the International Olympic Committee. They've been instrumental in helping us reach new audiences, and I think it's fitting, having heard his remarks before, that we end with his reflections. But thank you all so much for joining.
Dear President of the UN General Assembly, Your Excellency Volkan Bozkır, dear UN Under-Secretary-General Fabrizio Hochschild, dear participants, the fact that I can only greet you virtually is itself a reflection of the unprecedented situation we all are facing because of the global coronavirus crisis. We are all living with much uncertainty. This is why this dialogue comes at an important time. The world is looking for new ways to better understand and to address the far-reaching consequences. I would like to thank the President of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency Volkan Bozkır, for inviting me to be a part of this dialogue, commemorating the creation of the United Nations 75 years ago, and at the same time looking ahead to chart the course for the future we want and the UN we need. We are all still learning every day. But I hope very much that the first lesson we all learn from this crisis is we need more solidarity. Solidarity within societies and solidarity among societies. We have seen this call for greater global solidarity reflected in the UN75 report. Solidarity is at the heart of the Olympic Games, which unite the world in all its diversity. In these difficult times, we need the Olympic values of excellence, friendship, respect, and solidarity more than ever. As countries around the world are starting the long journey of recovery from the pandemic, sport is ready to contribute to rebuild a more human-centered and a more inclusive society. The UN recognized sport as an important enabler to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This crisis has made it clearer than ever that sport is the low-cost, high-impact tool par excellence for all countries in their recovery efforts. Sport and physical activity contribute directly to physical and mental health and to combat non-communicable as well as communicable diseases. Sport can save lives. We have seen this over the last few months. Sport has a great social significance by being the glue which bonds communities together. Sport plays a significant economic role. It creates jobs, generating business activity. In short, Sport is contributing to the recovery from the crisis on the health, the social, and the economic side. For all these reasons, we welcome and support the call of 118 UN member states to include sport and physical activity in their recovery plans and to integrate sport and physical activity into their national strategies for sustainable development. The global coronavirus crisis is only the latest challenge that highlights why the UN and its mission is more relevant than ever. At the IOC, we share the same values that define the UN. As the UN is celebrating 75 years of existence, we are proud to have decades of existing collaboration with the UN system on a very wide range of issues. The global pandemic has only underlined how important this cooperation is on so many levels. Both our organizations are built on peace and solidarity, and as such, we are uniquely positioned to continue to work together in a partnership towards a better and more peaceful world. We are always stronger together. The post-corona world will need this solidarity and will need sport. And we are ready to contribute to making the world a better place through sport. In this Olympic spirit of solidarity and determination, I wish you all the very best for the next 75 years and, of course, beyond.
Thank you all so much. I think we finished with some very stimulating words. We've taken very careful note of all that's being said, and it will feed into the next steps that the Secretary General is now pursuing, which is coming back with very, very concrete recommendations on how to make the aspirations we've gathered from peoples across the world real. And we will certainly try and live up to Mary Robinson's expectations that we use this moment as, in the words of the Secretary General, a 1945-like moment, and come back with very ambitious recommendations to our member states and to the world at large. And thank you again for helping and inspiring us. Change will depend on all of us, and I look forward to doing this journey together. Thank you.
Hasta pronto, Fabrizio. Thank you, everybody.
Ciao, Emilia. Gracias.
Thank you so much.
Ciao.